slightly apprehensive because of a camera. I have a face suited for radio, so forgive me. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Oh, sorry. For those of you who like to sleep through talks, there's 6 words on the board behind me, which is about all I've got to say, really. It's natural law, arrow going down, natural rights, arrow going down, human rights. Thank you for your patience. A question mark, as Father John indicated, points to a problem. Is being a Catholic, and I speak as one, an advantage or a disadvantage when we consider human rights? And, of course, it's both, and I'll try to illustrate how. And the talk really is divided into a beginning, a muddle, and an end. So the beginning is natural law, which of course is pre-Christian, is known in all sorts of cultures. But for us Christians, and especially Catholics, it's what carried the subject we're discussing tonight for many centuries. Natural law. When I was a law student many years ago, we were told that if you looked at all the meanings of a word natural and the meanings of a word law, and the meaning of natural law, you'd get 95 meanings. So it's not easy, it's not simple, it's got a history. Like most thinking, it has a history. And words have a history, and we have a history. And that's an important point to begin with. Natural law, then, pointed in a number of directions. It pointed to nature, what sort of thing we are. It, of course, linked us to all existing things, the stones and the stars and the rivers and plants and animals and angels, to everything that is, and to God, who makes it all possible. Whatever talk there would have been then of rights would have come out of that sense of the natural. Law points in various directions. Laws require a lawmaker. Laws don't make themselves. Another pointer to God and to our natures. Also, law, in all its different meanings, has a sense of limit and a sense of direction. Had we asked St. Augustine, had we asked St. Thomas Aquinas about natural law, they would have said all that, only more coherently and not in English. And that's where the story begins then. Natural law was how Catholics understood their place in the world and their relationship to the world, to God and to each other. Then, at some point, and for interesting reasons, the talk became more frequent of natural rights. That's the second set of words behind me. Notice the shift. Nature is still there. These aren't artificial rights. These aren't exclusively humanly made rights. They're to be linked to nature, but law now disappears. We're coming closer to our modern world of rights rather than law, and we'll see some of the consequences of this. And then the last step into the present, really, human rights. Just in those 6 words, notice what changes there have been. Now the natural has disappeared. It's the human. We walk about on a kind of stage we call the world, matter, a kind of backdrop of plants and animals, and of course no angels. It's all a backdrop to the human, which is all that counts. So nature's gone, but rights have remained. And they, in modern times, multiply, very specific, and a new thing can often be enforced in courts of law, which you couldn't really do with natural law or natural rights. So there are gains and there are losses. And you can see then how Catholicism, in this brief history, which is not, by the way, like a ladder you climb up and you forget where you've come from. Probably the greatest English-speaking, certainly, writer on natural law is a Catholic here in Oxford, Professor John Finnis. And in his epoch-making book, he takes human rights to be synonymous with natural rights. That's what he says. He says, all this book of mine could be called Natural Law and Human Rights, but he calls it Natural Law and Natural Rights. And when we come to see the epoch-making document by John the 23rd, which really brought human rights into the Catholic Church directly, he too speaks of natural law and natural rights. This is 1963. Well, what happened to all this? Well, in some senses, the Church didn't see all the signs of the times. In some senses, the Church, if I can talk in the abstract, undervalued the wisdom that could be found outside the Church, and tends to be slow, like all large institutions, to change. But there are also reasons for the, shall we call it, the skepticism of the Catholic Church in this move from natural law to natural rights to human rights. One was the Enlightenment, which gave people a different idea about what reason is, and it disconnected it from revelation, and it disconnected it from authority and authoritative teaching. And the two revolutions are the base of all this, which is not surprising. That in the United States, that in France. The United States producing a number of documents, including the Bill of Rights. The French Revolution producing le droit de l'homme, the rights of man. In the United States, it took the form of a strong separation of church and state, to use modern terms. In France, they went even deeper, and they went with a rejection of God and of Catholicism. And both in the United States and in France, it went, these new ideas of rights, equality, fraternity, went with a rejection of the church and its teaching function. And of course the monarchy. Both the United States and France rejected, and violently, its monarchs, who weren't just rulers, they were anointed by God to rule. Now all that's part of this story of human rights. So when we come after the horrors of World War II to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, we have the minutes of what went on. People involved have written their memoirs. And you see the story come into fruition. There's no mention of God, because lots of governments would never have signed up to anything that involved God. So God had to go. There's no mention of nature in the Universal Declaration, because lots of people found that philosophically unacceptable. So no God, no nature, just human rights. Human beings making their claims. 63, Pacem in Terris, peace on earth, where, if you like, human rights, although the Pope was very cautious, I think, kept away from the words, then Vatican II, lots of documents after Vatican II, and now we can say there's wholehearted support in principle for human rights in the Catholic Church. If we look at the list which Pope John the 23rd offered in Pacem in Terris of these natural rights, these basic rights, we notice a number of things. There's some 24, which is a relatively short list, but on the face of it, they're much like you'd find in the UN Declaration or in other secular documents. What does John the 23rd pick out? Right to life and worthy standard of life. And then there's a group underneath that. Rights pertaining to moral and educational values. Right to worship according to conscience. Right to choose one's state of life. Economic rights. Rights of meeting and association. Right to emigrate and to immigrate. Political rights. That's in a papal encyclical, papal teaching. So you might say, much of what we call human rights has come home in the Catholic Church. But some of the reservations haven't disappeared and will keep appearing, hence the question mark tonight. The UN Declaration, 1948, which is, if you like, the main modern document on human rights, is what it says. It's universal. That's going to be important. Doesn't matter which country you're in. It doesn't matter what law your country has or lack of it. These are universal rights. And it's a declaration which is halfway between saying it's natural and it's the construct of laws. It's declared. That's how it is. Rather like our natures. That's what we are. Which is a meeting point for Catholics, for Christians. And it has a number of advantages. It's specific in a way that natural law never could be. Or natural rights wouldn't really fit into the world as it had become. It's not law as such, it's a declaration. There's no court to enforce it. But it sets standards. Standards for living together, standards with which to criticize governments and international organizations. That's what it does. What then would we say today? Well, the first question is, there are risks in the word right as opposed to law. One of the risks is that on a strong sense of right, you've only got a right if someone has a duty to meet it. And if you think of we usually think of basic human rights, you then ask, all right, I'm entitled to a good standard of health. I'm entitled to decent housing. Well, who's to give it to me? And then you begin to see the inflated nature, perhaps, of rights talk, that without duties, the answer then comes, well, the state. But we know, starting from the United States, that many people are reluctant to have state involvement. They think precisely the point of human rights is to roll back the state, not to let it interfere with the free play of individuals. Well, that makes it harder, a non-involved state. Another big debate, which Catholics have to join in, but it's a debate among everybody, is what weight do you give to what are usually called socio-economic legal rights, and what weight do you give to what are usually called political rights? In a simplified sort of way, your socio-economic rights begin after you've had a first proper full meal. Your political rights begin at a police station. Now, if you're hungry, and as we sit here tonight, millions of people are hungry, your first worry isn't exactly how the political freedoms are going in your country, is how long will you manage to live, or your children. And you begin to see then that to formulate the rights is not as easy as it looks. The Italians have a saying that a man with a full stomach can't understand a starving man. So because none of us are in that kind of desperate need, we don't give quite such weight to political economic rights, to social economic rights. We're more worried about freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial, the right not to be imprisoned unjustly, and so on. That's another debate then, where Catholics can join in with others. We used to, when I was young, we used to divide the world between East and West. Now we don't anymore. We divide it between North and South. Now, when the world was divided between East and West, obviously the politics, the freedoms of the press, of speech, of assembly, of political parties loomed large in our discussions with the other. Now the world goes North and South, and there it's a matter of hunger, of immigration, emigration, of torture, a very different kind of world, and are human rights quite ready to cope, and how, with that? The UN Declaration could not mention God, because not enough people would sign up. It couldn't mention nature, because not enough people would sign up. What it did say was, they spoke of the inherent dignity of all members of a human family. So human family avoided any exclusions based on a race or notions, certain notions of nationality, nationalisms, and inherent dignity. They couldn't go further. Like all these documents, people sign up not just for different reasons, but for contradictory reasons, but you don't know. That's one of the snags of democracy, although there's no better system so far. It goes by a show of hands, that's numbers. Well, numbers don't talk. So you have no idea why people have voted together. And they could, as I say, they could have exclusive, mutually exclusive views, contradictory views, but it doesn't matter. You just count the numbers. Well, that's not a completely rational way of advancing the sense of a human or of dignity. Here too then, the Catholic and others, because the debate isn't between Catholics, Christians, and the others, the debate goes among the others as well. One difficulty is the extreme individualism now of a notion of rights, because of course it's been disconnected from nature and it's been disconnected from law, quite so explicitly, although it wasn't by John the 23rd. But generally in the world, because otherwise there would be no agreement, even in a democratic sense of agreement, they've been disconnected. So where we think then human dignity is in maximizing the number of choices. Therefore, it is said, a flourishing, humane world is where each individual has the most number of choices. That's all right up to a point. But how are you to know how to choose? Well, silence falls, because of course that would be directive. That would be getting back to law. I'm saying many things and rather quickly, but you can ask, and I'll try and answer at any point. From here where I'm standing, Herbert McCabe used to teach, and once Herbert gave an example, it's hard to better. So he gave an example. Supposing when you came in and you were asked to sit down, the chair you sat on, a leg came off and you fell over. Now you might say, well, no, I better not say what you might say, but translated for us, you might say, this is a bad chair. Now, of course, you don't mean morally bad. You mean it's not doing what a chair should do, which is to hold your weight with 4 legs. That's why it's a bad chair, because it's not being a chair. Supposing you came in and the prior anxious to keep you awake for at least half an hour, I'd put a number of eggs on some of the chairs and you sat down. Now again, you might say all kinds of things once you sat on the egg. I doubt if you'd think, this is a bad egg because it can't hold my weight. Well, why is a chair bad when it doesn't hold your weight, but not an egg? Well, because one's a chair, one's an egg. But until you know that, you could never say it's a bad anything. Well, so for us human beings. Without a sense of what it means to be human, how could you say this is bad, this is a bad action, this is a bad person? And the world of rights only is not going to give you that. And in John Paul the 23rd's, hello, something's gone wrong there, John the 23rd, so for those listening, that was a Freudian slip. In John the 23rd's encyclical, he makes a rather important and daring move, which is sadly we've seen in the aftermath of the Paris massacres of those journalists. John the 23rd not only makes the obvious point that we have duties to others as well as rights, but the more subtle point that with each right comes a duty on how to exercise it. So it's not I have a right, you have a duty, I have duties towards you, you have duties towards me. It's each right has built in a duty. And he gives examples. He says, the right of every person to life is correlative with a duty to preserve it. Hence, you don't just have a life, you have to stay alive and want to stay alive. When Aquinas had to think arguments against suicide, one of the arguments he thought may surprise us. He said, no, you can't commit suicide because you don't belong to yourself. You belong to the community, and you're impoverishing the community by going. But in our world of right, it's my right, my body, I do what I want with it. It's always my, because there's no built-in sense of duty. That was the first example John the 23rd gave. Here's another one. One's right to a decent standard of living with a duty of living becomingly. Not it's my money, I do what I want with it. Totally un-Catholic idea. Private property is a human right, but it comes with a social mortgage. It's not, it's my money, I can do what I want with it. How different it all looks. The other example he gives, which brings us close to the tragedy in Paris, among other places, one's right to investigate the truth freely, with a duty of pursuing it even more completely and profoundly. And that saying we hear so often in English, I wonder if it's any good. I don't agree with what he says, but I'd do anything for his right to say it. Now, luckily, I venture, none of us believes in free speech. Totally. Luckily. Would you want the right to be racist? Would you want the right to be obscene? Would you want the right to incite to hatred? Well, most of us say, well, no. But the illusion of every right being absolute stays with us. So any attempt by Catholics and others to somehow link duty and right intertwined is resisted because it's my right, my body, my money, my house. And that's it. It's very possessive. My, it's what I have, and not what I am, and not what I am in relation. To conclude, don't believe speakers when they say to conclude. That's lulling you. False sense of security. Another 20 minutes is coming up. But it isn't. So why, as a Catholic, do I support human rights with all the nuances Catholics and others would want to make? Why are Catholics so well placed in terms of human rights? Well, because we're over 1 billion as we sit here tonight. No Christian denomination, apart from the Catholic Church, is anywhere near that. Over 1 billion Catholics, which means we really are universal, which means we can get a sense of how different the world is and how wide it is. So that's one advantage we have. Another is that one of the important gains in human rights, as opposed to natural rights or natural law, is that they can be enforced. We're sitting in Europe. There's a European Convention of Human Rights. We're sitting in Britain. There's a Human Rights Act. All that you can go to court with, as it were. And that's a help, although it's not the only function of rights to be enforced. But still, to the extent it matters, then we have it. Well, of all the churches, the Catholic Church is the only one that is a sovereign body in international law. And the Vatican City State, which is the size of a big golf course, 44 hectares, is a sovereign state in international law. Well, no other church operates like that. It's so mixed up with the reality of authority and power and the need for human rights. Almost every country in the world sends an ambassador to the Holy See. No other Christian church, no other religion has anything like that. Nobody, except the Catholic Church. Virtually every country in the world sends an ambassador. The Holy See sends nuncios, kind of ambassadors, to virtually every country in the world, which again gives us a unique involvement in the world of human rights and the human community, the human family, and so on. Those are structures, if you like, more deeply, and especially as Dominicans, speaking as a Dominican priory, among the various Christian positions, ours as Catholics and as Dominicans, as affirm the goodness of nature, of creation. We don't think that because of sin, which we wouldn't underestimate, nature is corrupt, that it doesn't have any solidity anymore, any goodness. Well, again, in dealing with human rights, to have such a confident Christian view of nature can't be taken for granted, but is ours. And that gives us a way of meeting those who, for whatever reason, want to talk and spread human rights. And finally, again, this can't be taken for granted, but it's a very Catholic position and a very Dominican one. We've confidence in reason. And that's why we can enter dialogue, because we don't just offer, when asked, well, because God says so, or perhaps at a lower level, because the church says so. And then that's it. People say, well, I don't believe in God, or not Catholic. And the number of times I've heard conversations between people, and one side will say, well, it's because God says so. And the other would say, oh, all right. Well, we don't say that. Not only do we believe in the goodness of creation, without underestimating sin, but we've confidence in reason. And the meaning of law in natural law wasn't just an order, a command. It meant it was intelligible. That it was our privilege as humans to share intelligently in God's providential plan, what Thomas would have called eternal law. Stop.